Good morning, Professor. How are you? Doing the presentation you asked from us. I am at school, at my classroom, because there was no other place here and have no other place to do it. So I'm going to start with the presentation where I have the 15 quotes you asked from us, everything related to the readings you have sent. All right, so here I'm going to start by talking about behaviorism from Skinner. I'm going to relate that with zone of proximal development of Vygotsky, also the socio-cultural theory that I think that has an influence here. And I will also talk about, of course, universal grammar, monitor theory, input theory, and three observations that I consider were really important to relate to this topic, all right? So first of all, let's go with behaviorism. That, as it explains in Van Patten document, says that behaviorism attempts to explain behavior with a reference to mental events or internal processes. Rather, a behavior is explained solely with reference to external factors in the environment. So actually, it's talking about how the children learn from what is surrounding them. So they can learn from other students, they can learn from other teachers, they can learn from other adults at school. And it also goes related to stimulus and response, because here it talks about the dogs. It says that thus when the dogs hear the sound stimulus, they anticipated a meal and they would begin salivating their response. So to each stimulus, there is a response. So the children are going to have stimulus from their classmates, from their partners, and they also have stimulus from the teachers and from adults. Here I can relate the zone of proximal development wider, because it talks about how children can learn from a more knowledgeable one. So it's there is a relation to behaviorism, because in behaviorism they are learning from others, of course. And here in the zone of proximal development, they are because it specifies that they are going to learn, yes, from others, but especially from more knowledgeable ones, all right? And also we can relate here the social-cultural theory, because it talks about how people learn in context, how people learn from the culture where they live in. So of course, children are going to learn from the culture, from their environment. And here they are going to have the stimulus that comes from their environments. As I said before, in the case of zone of proximal development, the stimulus comes from the more knowledgeable one. And in the case of the culture, social-cultural theory, the stimulus comes from their surroundings, from their context, from the culture where they live in. So they're going to learn from that. Right. Thereafter, we have the classical conditioning, and it says, because of the repeated association of the sound with food after a series of trials, the sound alone caused the dogs to salivate. This is called classical conditioning. So here we can relate, of course, the zone of proximal development. Why though? Because usually the more knowledgeable ones have, of course, more knowledge than the ones are going to learn from them. And in that order of ideas, the children who are being taught can have like a classical conditioning coming from the others in order to learn. It can be a word, it can be a question, it can be whatever thing that causes the other students to understand, to get to the point, all right? Here also I dare say that there is the comprehensible input. But I'm going to talk about that later on, so I'm getting a little bit in advance, all right? So, but in a class, for example, when the teacher tells a word, the students can learn from that word. So here I will apply monitor theory, because of it comes to be natural. So the students get used to that condition, they get used to that word, and they will respond to that word. So now let's go with the fact that behaviorists say that in a given context, two events are naturally connected. Here, I like to relate to monitor theory. Eating and salivating, and a third one is introduced, that is sound. So, as I have said before, and I will talk about the monitor theory better than natural approach, because in monitor theory, Krashen talks about how students come to the learning naturally. And in this case, it is supposed that by a classical conditioning, by a stimulus and a response, the students may be able to learn naturally without the use of grammar and that stuff. Why am I saying this? Because they will respond to a stimulus, and the stimulus can be a question, the stimulus can be a word, the stimulus can even be repetition. So if something is repeated to the students a lot of times, they are going to get in their mind that repetition as a stimulus to respond whenever that stimulus comes to them. So in operant conditioning, an organism can be conditioned to engage in a behavior when the stimulus is no longer present, if it has learned the relevant associations with consistent feedback. Now, there, apart from the fact that we have stimulus, our repetitive stimulus, we also have the feedback. So they learn naturally, and the teacher makes the correction that is going to be the feedback, makes the pertinent corrections, and then the students can improve that knowledge. More than like learning, as Crashing would say in the monitor theory, they will improve the knowledge that they have acquired naturally. Now, acquisition will not happen if the learner is not exposed to inputs. That's the observation number one. And I like to relate it here because we have talked about behaviorism, we have talked about the stimulus, we have talked about response in classical conditioning, and also zone of proximal development. In all those, in all those things that I have mentioned before, there is something common, that is the exposition, the exposure to input of the second language. That, as I will explain later on, that input has to be clear, it has to be comprehensible. But we also have observations 2 and 3 that observation 2 says this observation captures that various aspects of language enters learners' brains when they are focused on communicative interaction. In other words, with incidental acquisition, the learner's primary focus of attention is the message contained in the input. So here we cannot, of course, there is also the behaviorism, because there is the stimulus of the communicative interaction. And based on that communicative interaction, the students are going to produce a response. So stimulus is going to be the message contained in the input, and the response is going to be the interaction with the other person. In observation 3, it says that captured here is the idea that learners attain unconscious knowledge about the second language that could not come from the input alone. So in this case, it talks about, of course, the stimulus of the input that has, as I have said before, that has to be comprehensible, which can lead them to our response. And we also have, of course, observation number 8, that is clear, however, that the first language does not have massive effects on either processes or outcomes, as once thought. Why do I mention this here? Because if we talk about the stimulus that is going to be a comprehensible input, the stimulus comes from the second language. So it may mean that the response that is going to be obtained will be in second language, of course, and L1 will not have any effect on that. Continuing on, we have here, of course, universal grammar. In universal grammar, I have two quotations here. It says, sometimes children must have the ability to invent some generative grammar and assign interpretation to sentences, which, once again, we can relate this with the behaviorism and zone of proximal development, because we're talking about a stimulus that comes from a more knowledgeable one. So in order to have this stimulus, the students are going to assign an interpretation to that stimulus. So in any case, when the feedback is given to them, they are going to understand, to modify and correct the knowledge they had in order to assign a correct interpretation to sentences. So here we have a stimulus, we have classical conditioning, we also have zone of proximal development, and the importance of the feedback. So if language differs so much from each other, how can there be any universals? And if there aren't, how can universal grammar have any content? Actually, here we're talking about the device to understand different languages. Device that is going to, of course, be activated by a stimulus, that is going to be the other language, right? So that is going to be the stimulus, activates the device, and then the device comes with the outcome. All right. So we have the monitor theory, as I've told you before, that learners acquire grammatical structures in natural order. And also we have universal grammar here. It seems clear that many children acquire first or second languages quite successfully, even though no special care is taken to teach them and no special attention is given to their processes. Progress. This comes from jacking off, and this other one comes from crashing. So in the monitor theory, as I have said some minutes ago, it comes basically from the input. So it's based on what Krashen says, the learners are going to acquire the grammatical structure in natural order that comes from the input that I will add from a more knowledgeable one. So here we have the relationship between monitor theory, behaviorism, and also zone of proximal development. And here, of course, we talk about the stimulus of a comprehensible input, even though there is no attention to their progress, because there is going to be a stimulus. And to that stimulus, there is going to be a response. So from monitor theory, it turns out learned knowledge is not terribly useful. Its primary function is editing acquired knowledge during language production. So I'll relate this with the feedback and also the classical conditioning, because there is a stimulus, there is going to be a response. The stimulus will be helpful to acquire the second language, but when there is a feedback, the students are going to acquire a knowledge, and that knowledge that they have acquired will be useful to modify the acquired knowledge during language production. So it's going to be only feedback that is going to modify the wrong things that students have acquired based on this theory. Finally, we have the input hypothesis that humans acquire language in only one way, by understanding messages in the L2 or by receiving comprehensible input. Once again, comprehensible input refers to the stimulus, and the way of understanding and what they produce later on is going to be the response. So, Professor, basically that's my presentation. Thanks a lot. Have an excellent day.